So I'm going to go over some of the same sort of ground as Gary did, perhaps from a less academic perspective, being a British Council officer, and based on really the experience, a synthesis of the experiences that we see from governments and educational authorities around the world. Let me start out with this controversial thesis of where we are here. Latin America, you can see there's various perspectives and ways in which it's different from Europe and it's different from Africa. And these strategic realities are likely to impact upon the decisions you take and the success you're likely to have. You can argue with me on some of these afterwards. Because of lack of time, I won't go into the detail of each. We can talk about it later. I finished off a year ago in Cartagena with this slide, which was basically an indication of a range of different criteria and aspects which will lead to successful learning. And the reason I do it is really to highlight that so many of these are not under the control of any Ministry of Education. They're wider social aspects, healthy children, internet access. Not really. Certainly a relevant curriculum, there's something for the Ministry of Education and the authorities. But English on TV, to what extent is that under the Ministry of Education's control? And this will lead more into tomorrow, where we have a wider discussion beyond the classroom. Talking a little about primary education, the move to an earlier start to English has been one of the big moves in English over the last decade or two. Here are some of the issues that we identified, Gail Ellis and myself, in a paper following the International IATEFL conference last year. A range of different controversies around this. This is a comment from Janet Enever's book, Early Language Learning in Europe, which again is available online, the British Council website. And the interesting thing here is the comment, to what extent can we be sure that an early start will really achieve greater long-term rewards? That's still uncertain. And I think it's true to say, Janet, you can tell me if I'm being unfair, that really during that whole project, it was relatively difficult to actually measure cognitive, if you like, measure actual increase in language knowledge in these examples in Europe of implemented English learning. And in fact, we can see the extent of the movement here from a paper that we've also done by Sheila Rickson on more or less when different countries typically start teaching English. And you see the great movement there is that the majority of countries are starting here in year one, with other countries coming in later, some after year 5 or in secondary, which of course with limited resources is what sometimes might be the most recommended thing to do. But the interesting thing is that when you look at the 7 countries in the Ellie report in Europe, this is how many lessons of English per week they were given. And what you can see here is that essentially what you're talking to us about is a reality that there's very little time available within the curriculum for English. So typically you might be looking at an hour and a half a week of teaching. And one has to ask oneself, if that is all they get, what can you really expect? Are you really teaching children English when they're 8 years old in order to achieve an actual improvement from, let's say, A0 to A1 or A1 to E2? And so the question is, why are you doing it? Of course, you may be doing it for other reasons, educational reasons, cultural reasons, understanding of the self and the other. into the beginning of intercultural awareness, and these things are all very valid. Really, these are some questions I put down to... This microphone doesn't like me, does it? Some questions to be thinking about for the group work, really. Moving on to secondary, I think the only serious international comparison of achieved English proficiency that I've come across is the one commissioned by the European Commission. It's called the European Survey of Language Competencies, which compared where basically 14 and 15-year-olds in different countries had got to after a few years of English. And there are the results, basically. The winners are at the bottom, but let's look at some of the ones who didn't do so well. Let's take Spain, for example. I don't know how easy it is for you to interpret these, but you can see that only 15% of students got to a level B2, but 20% before didn't get to A1, and 33% got to A1, meaning more than half, 53% of Spanish students, after learning English in secondary school for some time, didn't get beyond A1, which is a very interesting point about the effectiveness of the current model of teaching English. The contextual conclusions that this survey came to, was basically, but an earlier onset is related, presumably because there was some, we don't know whether that was because of the advantage of learning some English earlier, or because by learning English earlier, you get more total exposure to the language. But there are other things here that, again, not really very much under the control of the educational system, the kind of home that they're coming from, the exposure through the media, student beliefs, and here's a methodological one, finally, that at least the teacher training colleges should have under their control. Let's teach our teachers to use English in the classroom. And I don't know to what extent this is still a debate in Latin America, but I know when I lived in Chile 7 to 10 years ago, it certainly was a debate. And so I'd be interested to know if things have moved on. I'm sure things have moved on within the initial teacher training programs, but it takes a long time to feed through. And there are some questions for secondary. Useful models beyond the standard 4 lessons a week. Interesting. I think it was the Minister of Education this morning that was talking about the Campamento de Verano and Campamento de Invierno, yeah? As another model, and she certainly gave me the impression that was having been put into a special environment where suddenly there's a need or a reason for speaking English. It's not just because it's 11:30 on a Tuesday morning, it's the English lesson. It's something special, they're there for a week, they're immersed in some way, generates a better desire to learn and indeed greater learning. I think English in higher education, in universities in particular I'm thinking about, is also changing. Again, if I can go back even 10 years, I could see two different sorts of learners really within most Latin American university systems. We've developed this taxonomy, an A, B, C, D, E, F taxonomy. This is C. C is Cleo. Called her the standard English learner. So who's Cleo? Cleo is, let's say, possibly a biology student, an undergraduate possibly, or it could be physics, or it could be history, or it could be law, but she decides for one reason or another, either because the system says so, or because she thinks it's a good idea, or because her mum and dad think it's a good idea, she's also learning English. Maybe she's learning English in the university, maybe she's learning English on the internet, maybe she's learning English in a private institute. Very different from Flo. Flo is our specialist English learner, basically doing what you might call in Chile a licenciatura de inglés. Quite likely she wants to specialize. Most likely she's going to finish up as an English teacher for some of all of her time. But you can see it's quite a different need there and a different sort of student. But in fact, the situation is changing very, very rapidly in Europe and parts of Asia, I would say, because of the advent of English medium instruction in higher education. And so, thinking about English medium instruction, we've got to add into these our type A, Anna, is what we've called a traditional learner who, from Brazil, but goes to the States to learn and needs specific training in order to be able to cope with that different reality. But now there's a new type. The Brazilian student of biology or business studies who stays in Brazil and learns part of their degree, or in some cases all of their degree, through the medium of English. The State University of Sao Paulo is doing some of this. Christopher mentioned the Tec de Monterrey, aiming for 20% of their courses through English medium instruction, and I'm convinced this will come to Latin America in quite a big way, and that's what will be top of the agenda in 5 years' time. And that brings us to another type of learner in higher education that was not really considered as a type of learner 10 years ago, and that's the staff at universities. And there are two distinct kinds of staff. One is the EMI teacher, who suddenly, having taught biology or law or whatever in their own native language, is suddenly, this is happening in Europe quite a lot, it's quite worrying. I mean, put yourself in this position. You're an economics professor, you're 40 years old, you've got 15 years experience of teaching economics in Italian, and suddenly the rector of the university says, well, carry on, just next year you'll be teaching it in English. Quite a worrying scenario. The Politecnico di Milano, a very prestigious institution, finished up in court as a result of this. And the international researcher. The need for researchers now, academics, to be able to present at conferences, to write publications, and indeed, perhaps most importantly of all, to bid for money for research, often in English, in an international environment from organisations like the European Union. And there we have some questions for the tertiary situation. Underpinning all these sectors is the issue of teacher training and teacher development. I've illustrated this by our own British Council Continuing Professional Development Framework, which, if you like, categorises, it's a model, it categorises teachers into the various stages of their career. A starting teacher who's usually in initial teacher training, or a newly qualified teacher in typically the first couple of years of their career, a developing teacher in the first few years of their career, and then a proficient teacher, each of whom needs a different approach or set of approaches. But underlying it, of course, is the assumption that, like any profession, there'll be continuing learning throughout the career. And coming back to tomorrow, the big issue that we see more and more is what happens outside the classroom and how that impacts inside the classroom. and how our societies can do those things, and how educationalists can influence societies where they don't have control over things like this. It seems to me that, in a way, the big challenge for a place like Latin America is to balance the, if you like, the demands that are put on public education systems, demands to create a national identity, to make the community hang together, demands to make the community internationally competitive, and demands to reapportion resources, including learning opportunities, between different groups. And the big question is how to, on the one hand, give a wide range of people the opportunity, including people from lower income groups in particular, or the rural people in the rural areas, give them access to be able to aspire to English and to be able to join a group of internationally active people who previously might have been from a socio-economic elite, privately educated. Balance that with a need to have a group of people, not all the population, but a group of people in the cohort who have a high proficiency of English that's going to allow them to really interact internationally. Because frankly, getting to A2 or B1 level is not going to allow you to do many jobs at an international level. And that comes back to the university, if you like. What is the role of the university? Is the role of the university remedial teaching, or is the role of the university what you might typically think of is advanced learning? And in fact, I think it's, in most cases, both, of course. That's my latest list of the big trends in English and English language learning over the last decades. Things we see all around the world. With the move to EMI at the bottom, that's the one that's really still to come to this part of the world. And the final consideration is a synthesis of where we see success in systems. I'll just go through this one briefly. We see success in Sweden, in Singapore, and we see a correlation between English happening in the environment, English newspapers, the media, on the street, mobility, people traveling, and the quality of English. We see a correlation between high English proficiency and high quality teaching. And we also see a correlation, I think, between high quality teaching and high prestige of teachers. We see success where systems put particular resources into language to make them centres of excellence. And I can name a number of different countries around the world that have, on a usually and ideally a meritocratic basis, have specialist language colleges or bilingual colleges which are dedicated to turning out people at the age of 18 who are at a B2, C1 level of English, which is highly resourced context. We see success where student exams and qualifications match the needs. We see failure where they don't. Most obviously, places like Japan and Korea have failed not because they're not training their teachers, but because the exams do not match. We see a comprehensive and sustained national strategy. Success stories in this part of the world are places like Chile and Colombia, where all the stakeholders are taken into account, where decisions are delegated down to institutional level so that local people can deal with local problems, and where all elements of the curriculum, the assessment, the teacher training are taken into account. Where it's not just for English, where it's for maths and science, so that the English teacher feels part of a whole school drive towards excellence. I've been given the red card, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.